Hi, it's Lisa Ackerman. I'm TACA's Executive Director, and I'm so happy and grateful for my two friends on this blog today. You have Dana Crucil and Tim Adams. We're going to talk about IEPs. Families are facing some unprecedented times with the lack of school services, especially to children of all ages with autism. And the goal today of this interview are taking some of the questions we're hearing over and over again and try to share some of those answers with you. For our non-autism friends, we know so many families are struggling with massive change in schedules, loss of services, regression, aggression, self-injury, and wandering. And this is all due to COVID, autism, and just a massive upheaval for our families. So the stuff that we're going to talk about today is very California focused. IEPs are universal, individual education plans across the United States. That's a law federally, but we're going to focus more on the California specifics. And I know Tim and Dana both said to me, there's no way to address every nuance and every situation. And what we'll try to do is give families resources in this blog so they can find and get support. We'll also do our best to answer questions. So really our whole goal is to navigate COVID waters and special education for autism. So sorry for the long introduction. Dana, thank you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
All right, well, thank you, Lisa. So yes, I'm Dana Crucil. I'm a BCBA. I have also worked on the funding side for a little over 6 years, managing insurance-based services for individuals with autism across the U.S. I also have an adult sister with autism, whom I assist in her services as well. I also teach at Arizona State University and their behavior analytic program, as well as consult. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Dana. And Tim, we go way back. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So Lisa, thanks for inviting me today. We do go way back. We've been, I think, at this at times even as a team in the same IEP meeting for 18 years at some point. I think I've been in practice for 20 years. My clients are families impacted by a variety of different disabilities. We've served hundreds of families across California and some even out of state. We do a lot of cases that involve students with complex needs. Some cases have been on appeal, even through various court systems, federal courts, even the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We represent families who are usually seeking services that school districts aren't willing to provide. So we're stepping in to help secure funding for a program for a student that the school district hasn't been willing to fund that program, whether it be a private school, supplementary program or service, therapeutic interventions, a variety of different services. We're there to help the family secure whatever is most appropriate for that student. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys are dedicated to helping provide answers for families, and that means so much to me and TACA, so thank you. So I'll kick it off with Tim. How do IEPs work during COVID times?
Well, interesting, they work the same way. Nowadays, especially with clear direction from the U.S. Department of Education and also Senate Bill 98, IEPs, there's some slight changes in what districts have to offer, but IEP timelines are still the same. If there's a concern about an annual review and a school district has scheduled it, the parent, the district has an obligation to schedule that IEP for under the same timeline. If the parent has a concern outside of an annual review, it's still a 30-day response timeframe, at least in California. But there really aren't any procedural changes. Nothing procedurally under the IDA has ever changed, whether it be the schools closed or not closed. Certain states put together plans, they called emergency plans, that impacted student rights and in some cases violated student rights, but federal law has never changed.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. Dana, talk to me about what insurance covers, especially right now during COVID.
Right, so it's similar to kind of explained. If you have met criteria to initiate care or to start care, you're in services, obviously. It looks like the main issue that we're seeing right now is because of the cut services on the school side or the lack of in-person services, families are wanting to supplement or access more hours through their insurance company to kind of supplement this lack of hours that's happening. So basically, that's always an option. You know, you would submit an addendum, your funding source, depending if you are funded by Medi-Cal or Medicare plan, or if you are a commercial plan. That's something that your ABA provider would do, and that's always an option. There are some kind of like ways that I would suggest going about that, which I think we can get into later, but those services are in place. There are ways to get increased hours, but there's certain verbiage that you should be using and not using, because as you know, your home insurance-based hours are not supposed to be used to supplant services or support academic time.
Excellent, great to know. Tim, shooting this one over to you. How can parents document distance learning is not working for their children on the spectrum?
How can they document it? Well, every IEP has to be followed in a comparable fashion. So if you had an IEP before COVID, that IEP needs to be implemented in a comparable manner during COVID. So if it's all in home and it's a distance learning plan, we need to figure out how to provide services in an effective way. And that may include having the school district contract to provide in-person services, even in the home, provide alternative settings to implement services that are listed in the IEP. But it has to be implemented in a comparable fashion. Understandably, if schools are closed, it can't be precisely the same. There could be some adjustments, but it really needs to be very similar.
Excellent. Dana, we have a lot of new families that are struggling to get appointments for assessments. And what would you recommend for a family with a 3-year-old to do if they're new? Obviously COVID time, sorry, I don't mean to state the obvious, but what should a new family do?
I think if you're coming out of the regional center, say the 0 to 3 program, or if you have a child that's under the age of 3 and they have a diagnosis, you should be going through your insurance right away. There's really no reason to stay with the regional center if you have a diagnosis of autism. The criteria for insurance companies to initiate services is autism diagnosis. If you have Medi-Cal, you can access services with some other type of developmental disability as long as you have a recommendation for ABA. If you have Medi-Cal, it is their responsibility and legal responsibility to find you someone who can give you that diagnosis or who can schedule that appointment and give you access to that. Medi-Cal is actually under very strict constraints when it comes to access to services and access to care. If you are under a commercial plan, I would recommend calling your insurance company and asking a list of providers who are in network with them that you can have access to. I mean, that's also part of what you're paying for in your explanation of benefits. But it looks like the magic ticket, obviously, to accessing those services is going to be an autism diagnosis. So I would recommend basically calling your care manager, looking at the medical necessity criteria and understanding exactly what's needed. And they should be providing you in-network doctors that you can go to.
Great, great. That will help so many families. Thank you. Tim, the great questions that are coming up over and over again is how much do you hold the school district accountable for the IEP, like speech, occupational therapy, lunch buddy, social skills?
They're 100% accountable for the services in the IEP. And again, the IEP still has to be implemented in a comparable fashion. So if something can't be implemented, and there's some circumstances where perhaps a physical therapy service, which is largely in person to be effective, can't be implemented, then our position is that those hours need to be banked and made up later. So when it's safe to go back to an in-person therapeutic service or instructional model, then that service could be implemented at a later time. But to the extent that you can implement them now, in a virtual context or provide some or all of the services in home or at a separate site, the law still requires that it happen that way.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. That question comes up a lot. Dana, what can parents do through insurance to help with distance learning? ABA companies are pushing back and they can't always help during distance learning. So do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so that's a tough one because there is a fine line between ABA and home and school-based services, right? And they're not really supposed to overlap. Your in-home ABA people are not supposed to be working on academic goals. I have heard and seen of some ABA companies being in home while the child is doing the distance learning to support behavior concerns, not academics, but being there to facilitate, step in when there are behavior concerns. I have also seen some districts offering a one-to-one learning environment on site that I have seen ABA agencies sending their one-to-ones to the site, again, to aid and facilitate with behavior. When you say that you're there to support academics, basically you're asking for a denial from your insurance company. You should never say that. There are ways to go about it, but obviously the virtual environment is not practical for all people, or it's not feasible. What I've seen is maybe the families are trying to get extra supplemental hours from the insurance company and saying that the child is experiencing a very high level of regression due to school services not occurring. And in that instance, there have been some ways that have been successful being able to get more hours to kind of make up the difference until the school can get their act together, or some type of hybrid model is in place with the school where they can go back to at least a site and have some personal interaction off the computer.
Excellent. That's so important. Thank you. Tim, so many families are telling us that their assessments can't be finished because they can't do a classroom observation. How do you tackle that one?
We've actually been tackling that since schools closed in March. And
Okay.
One of the first things I did was get on the phone with independent assessors and brainstorm about ways that they could complete observations. And so if the classroom is in a virtual context, then observations can happen virtually. The assessor for the district, the independent assessor can easily hop on a Zoom session, and they can even do so confidentially, without the child knowing that they're there. In fact, in many cases, you don't want a child changing her behavior because they see somebody who's unfamiliar. You want to get the most accurate picture of that child's needs in that environment. So that person could, hop on as a student teacher without sort of a generic name, observer, whatever may be appropriate. But yes, observations can absolutely happen in a virtual context.
God, that's awesome. Thank you. Dana, so in-home services during COVID, I know you talked about academics and behaviors, but can it cover the, social skills, life skills, and other types of therapy?
Yeah, so under the AMA codes, the medical codes that insurance companies have adopted, there is actually a social skills code, very rarely requested. And I don't know if this is just due in part to lack of the provider's knowledge of the code, or the agency doesn't maybe have a social skills, stuff. But yes, the social skills group, there's typically, from what I've seen, there's two codes. There's one where it's basically one CBA and multiple individuals that are in the group, and the BCBA is billing individually. Or you have basically, you can do one-to-one in a group setting where you are with your paraprofessional in a group setting, and you can bill it that way. It just depends, logistically, if you're going to one-to-one in a group setting, which would be the direct code, you're going to bill that social skills code. But yes, that is an option. I think it should be taken advantage of and used, especially if you have a learner that is maybe doing great one-to-one setting and you want to really work on that skill, their skills generalizing in a group environment, or they just maybe have social skills deficits. So that's obviously an option. There are certain age gaps or age cutoffs, like for instance, Medi-Cal, your ABA benefit would cap at age 21, but most commercial plans don't have an age cutoff. So as long as you are technically meeting criteria and there's still a need, they can't deny based off your age. So if you're 17 and maybe you don't need direct services at some comprehensive level program, but you have pretty severe social deficit, that would be a time where your provider should be requesting a social skills code and not a direct code.
Excellent. Excellent. Get that question all the time. Thanks. So Tim, a lot of people have one-to-one aids in school, but don't have that aid for distance learning. The school district's not providing it. What should a family do if they need that one-to-one aid at home to do distance learning successfully?
Many school districts have the capability to provide one-to-one instruction at home. The concern has less to do with the student's need or logistics, but more to do with liability concerns. If they send a staff member, there could be a collective bargaining agreement that may be violated if somebody gets sick or hurt in the home. There's insurance-related concerns, talking about liability insurance if somebody's injured. So districts are, they're reluctant to send somebody to the home, but it's possible and it's necessary for many students. And so what I've seen school districts do is if they have an outside or third-party contractor, like what we call in California as a non-public agency, an NPA, or even an NPS. Some of my clients, some students have been attending a certified non-public school, and that non-public school has an aide already on staff that would be providing virtual support. I've had districts agree and offer to provide that one-to-one instructor in the home. I've also had districts more so offer to bring students back to campus to provide the one-to-one support on campus. And this might surprise you, but even the teachers aren't back in the classroom. So what's happening is the student's in the classroom with the one-to-one aide, but the teacher is zooming in to the classroom and is in a different room. I've seen that happen a few times. So there is the ability to provide one-to-one support. It may be in the home, it may be at a different site, but they may not have both the one-to-one instructor and the teacher in the same room.
Great, those are great options, and thank you. That's something's coming up a lot. So Dana, question about insurance. Do they ever, can they stress a requirement for a certain percentage of applied behavioral analysis hours to be done in school and home and clinic or in social settings?
Yeah, so this is a tough one, and this comes up a lot, even in cases that I'm working on for appeals and whatnot. It really is case health plan specific. So Medi-Cal, for instance, has designated a ratio for that, and that's in their plan letter. So if you're violating that ratio, it can technically be denied. It really comes up to the plan as how strictly they're going to enforce that ratio. So like for instance, in Medi-Cal in California, I believe they have some ratio where I believe you can't do more than 50% of the direct hours in a school. So you could do a portion in the school, a portion in clinic, a portion at home. They have outlined that contingency. Some other health plans, it's really case by case. If you make a strong case and a rationale as to why you need some support in the school, I haven't seen a lot of those getting formally denied. It's more of like, we're going to be supporting in the school for a portion of the hours for this long, and it usually goes through. Where I have seen issues and denials is where all the hours are being done in the school, because then the insurer is like, what is the school district doing? Why are we supplanting the school district, right? It becomes this back and forth situation of who's responsible. But like I said, usually when it's some sort of ratio, it's not a huge concern, but again, it's really specific to the particular plan.
No. All right, Tim, here's one for you. Can parents seek non-public agency services for speech and OT, especially if clinics are closed at school?
So I'm sorry, cut out for a second. Lisa, can you repeat that?
So sorry. Can parents seek the NPA services for speech and OT outside of the school if the school is closed?
Yes, absolutely. If the services, especially if the services are listed in the student's IEP and they're not being provided by the district, again, to go back to what I had said previously, the school district is still obligated to implement the IEP in a comparable fashion. So if they're not doing that, and parents are forced to secure private programs or services or even a private school because it's not being implemented, they have a right to pursue reimbursement for those costs.
Great. Thank you, because we get that all the time. All right, Dana, hit me again on some of the adult services for in that are insurance covered. You talked a bit about social skills. Is there anything else covered for adults?
You know, there's no real code under the AMA codes for like vocational job coaching. That typically goes on to the regional center side. But, you know, within social skills code, I would say there's some wiggle room. And if you do have someone that's older and you are getting one-to-one services, in my mind, there's ways to embed types of job coaching and vocational type skills that can be made functional and based in the community. It's the way it's written into the report. If you have a 17-year-old client, for instance, that you're working on that client accessing the bus route, you're working on them going to the grocery store, buying their own groceries, you're helping them prepare for job interviews and things like that. If you're writing that in the report in a way that comes across as babysitting, academic, vocational job coaching, like those are going to be probably flagged and questioned. But if you're writing them in a way, if you're writing those in a way that's functional and really outlining the medical necessity, those are more likely going to be put through. So there are ways to access services for adults. I wouldn't, you know, and again, it's going to come down to the specific of the individual, their behaviors, what their developmental scores are, things like that. But there are ways to go through that. But I also always recommend that parents are accessing respite services and basically getting what they can from the regional center as well, which, you know, we've talked about that before. Those services aren't necessarily advertised, but TACA is really good about kind of helping families navigate that as well.
Excellent, thank you. Tim, there's some interesting scenarios that are happening with families that have their special ed kids back in school. General ed is not in school, and we have kids that are fully mainstreamed or included in general ed setting. What do parents do in that situation if they're not, you know, if they're being told to distance learn for general ed when they were in general ed settings before COVID?
That's a challenge. It can be a challenge. So if a school district isn't resuming in-person instruction, and every county is different, even in California, you know, what happens in Orange County, where we live, may be different than Riverside County, maybe different than San Diego County. And there are circumstances where, based on California directives, the Department of Public Health, for example, districts are being encouraged to bring the most vulnerable population of students back onto campus, but keeping general ed students and students even with IEPs who are primarily in general ed at home. If that environment is not appropriate, then a parent needs to call an IEP meeting immediately and discuss what in-person instruction may be appropriate to, you know, that complies with the IEP. And if the district can't provide that on its own campuses, then they may be looking at a private school option that is open.
That's great. Good to know. Thank you. And this is a question for both of you. Dana, I'll start with you. How does regional center help in crisis situations like a COVID?
I think this is tricky. I think basically if you're in that 0 to 3 population, you don't have a diagnosis, like regional center is on the hook and they're responsible for that population. I know if you do have a diagnosis, regional center is then basically passing the buck to the insurance company. If you have benefits or you have a plan that's not covered, AB is not, you know, included in your explanation of benefits, then it does go back to the regional center. But from my understanding, regional center is still fully responsible for finding you an AB provider. You're in the 0 to 3 population, and same with those other early intervention services, speech, PT, feeding, all those types of services. If you're under the age of 3, if you're over the age of 3 and don't have a diagnosis, I think you stay with regional center as well. So it really is dependent on your age and if you have a diagnosis of autism or not.
Got it. Tim,
And I
anything
think
to
it
add?
gets, you're right when you say it's tricky, Dana, because I've spoken to parents where they were in the midst of a transition from 3 on, and the baton should have been passed to the school district, but the school district was closed, and the regional said, sorry, center said, sorry, we can't help you because Part C says we're done at 3. And that made, I've heard that a couple of times, and it's unfortunate because the parent then is in this limbo where they can't get support from the regional center and the school district is not helping them. I would say they have claims against both potentially. The regional center is the payer of last resort if insurance hasn't kicked in to provide support for the family. But it's unfortunate that the parent has to navigate that because the school district isn't picking up the tab for services, isn't having an IEP, isn't completing its assessments on, based on its procedural obligations. The law hasn't changed. Part B of the IDA, Part C of the IDA still exists. The early intervention services, the timelines. If anything, we got direction in April from Secretary DeVos that there should perhaps be an extension for early intervention programs, but the core tenets of the IDA should remain intact. That was her letter to Congress in April. We haven't seen Congress take action. Obviously, we had a pretty polarized scenario between the two parties trying to get the stimulus passed, but we have yet to see what's going to happen in the future. If anything, I think there should be extensions. I agree with the secretary on that.
I agree too, and I actually had a case where we were trying to get an extension for a client, and the regional center basically said no. So the parents put the kid in private school because they just didn't want to wait for the public school to step and assess. And unfortunately, that's not an option for everyone. But in that situation, that's what they decided to do. And that's unfortunate. And I feel like unacceptable.
I agreed 100%. I mean, I've had the same discussion with the family asking about options. And my recommendation at the time was if the district is not taking responsibility, that is a pretty significant procedural violation on their part, and you will have a right to pursue that claim. You've got a 2-year statute of limitations to do that, but if you have the means, you can place your child in a private program and even access insurance to secure aid support. I've had insurance companies come to the table and are willing to fund that aid support, and I know that they're particular about when it's provided, but if the school isn't helping at all, I have had some families find a way to get coverage to get that aid support in a private program.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And Tim, you briefly mentioned compensatory services. The services were not happening and now they turn it on. Can families go back and make up time?
Correct. So the compensatory education, we call it, that's the general term that describes what a student may be entitled to if they lost an educational opportunity as a result of a school district failing to meet its responsibilities to provide what the law calls a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE. It's not we call it an equitable remedy because even if you miss 200 hours of speech, you may not need exactly 200 hours to make up for those losses. So ultimately a court or a judge decides what's equitable in that circumstance. But the general rule is you want to keep track of how many services were listed in your IEP that were missed, and that is the number you would ask the district to provide. And at some point, the district will probably want to negotiate with you and say, well, we don't think all of that's necessary. And that may be at the point at which you decide to file your due process complaint and then enter into more formal negotiations on what level of service. But every student who had an IEP and whose IEP was not implemented, regardless of California law, between March and July, has a claim for compensatory education. Every student.
That's so important.
There are very few where a school district comparably implemented that IEP. In most cases, it was just a fraction of service that was even offered under that IEP, and it certainly wasn't comparable.
Wow, I could probably ask 100 more questions. I think we hit most of the ones. We're going to post resources, like I said, and I'll link it to both Dana and Tim so you can find these great resources. I want to mention to families who are watching this, United Cerebral Palsy, Orange County, and most locations are doing respite services and can work with your insurance if you need help. And that's also available nationally. I also want to tell parents COVID will pass someday. We hope sooner than later. TACA will be here. We're providing support. We're doing virtual meetings and hangouts, and we'll continue to support you every way possible. But we'll put the resources here. And Dana and Tim, I so appreciate you guys for dedicating your time, donating it back, and helping families navigate these tricky waters. So truly, thank you both.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.